Hello everyone. Well, here we are. It's 2 months now since we've been in this lockdown situation, and it's becoming quite a trial and a severe test for many people. Now, the Bible tells us an awful lot about trials and tests, and if we read in the book of James, the epistle from James, he tells us how to appropriate trials and tests. He said, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone." The Apostle James here is telling us about trials, about tests, and about temptations. Now, what's interesting is that in the original Greek language that James is using here, trials, tests, and temptation is all the same word. It's the Greek word pirazo. It can be translated trial, it can be translated a test, and it can also mean a temptation. And what we're finding right now at this minute in this awful situation we're in, people are going through a trial, they're going through a test, and they're going through many temptations of what to do and what to choose and what they can or can't do. Now, James tells us that if we persevere through this trial, this test, and this temptation, it actually uses this word blessed. We're going to be blessed. We're blessed if we can persevere through this trial, this test, and this temptation. And this is what we find ourselves in right at this moment in time. Now, what kind of trials and tests and temptations are we going through? Well, the Bible tells us. All the way through, this word, pirazo, it designates a kind of trial, test and temptation that we're going through. Here's what the Apostle Paul said was a trial to a church. He said in Galatians chapter 4, verse 13, he says, "As you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. And even though my illness was a trial," pirazo, "even though my illness was a trial to you, you did not treat me with contempt or scorn. Instead, you welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Jesus himself." Here Paul says to the church, I'm speaking to the church right now, this situation might be a trial as it was to the church, but Paul says through that trial, the gospel was preached. Through this situation we are in, the gospel is being preached as never before. What's actually happening, although many of us can't perceive it, is that many people are tuning in to hear what the gospel, what the Bible is in this situation. Is this the end times? What is God's answer in this situation? And although it's a trial, and remember Paul says this trial was through an illness, it's through a disease, it's through a sickness, through the very thing that we're going through now. Although it's a trial to the church, actually, the gospel is being preached, and this church grew because of this trial, because of this sickness that they had to endure and help Paul through. So let's see that and see our way through blessing, because when we're in a trial, it can often be very severe. Here's what we read in the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, in chapter 2, Jesus says this again to a church. In chapter 2 and verse 10, he says to the church in Smyrna, "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you." It's the same word, pirazo. It's a test, a trial, a temptation to test you. "And you will suffer persecution for 10 days. But be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the victor's crown." Jesus again promises this victory and this reward, even though they were going to go through this trial. What was this trial? It was a trial of prison. It was a trial of restriction, a trial of confinement, and this can be one of the most severe trials when you're trapped in. When you're tested and you think, I can't do anything, what's the point? It can affect your mental health. It can affect your emotional well-being. I can't see my family. I can't see my friends. I can't go to work. God says this is a test, but you will receive the victor's crown through this test if we're faithful to Jesus. This trial can bring all kinds of emotional problems. In the book of Peter, here's what we read. In the book of 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, here's how the Apostle Peter describes the trials that we're going to go through. In verse 6 he says, in all this, in all the things that the church is going through, you greatly rejoice, though for a little while you may have had to suffer grief and all kinds of trials. These have come so that your proven genuineness of your faith, which is of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire. Here, Peter tells us that we're going through pain and grief, but it's only like gold being refined in a fire. When you put the gold in a fire, a fiery trial, it doesn't actually change the gold. It just purifies it. The gold comes out purer and cleaner and more refined than ever before. Although Peter acknowledges there is grief going on, actually your faith is being made strong if you have a genuine faith. When he gets towards the end of this epistle, in chapter 4, here's what he says in chapter 4 and verse 12. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal, he says the same thing again, that has come on you to test you. The same word, periazo, trial, test, temptation. Do not think there's something strange is happening to you, but rejoice. Peter tells us, look, this is going to come out to our benefit. Although we will go through this grief and these fiery trials, God is going to bring us out as gold. Jesus said the same things to his apostles at the end of his ministry. In Luke chapter 12, he said, you have stood with me through my trials, through his tests, through his temptations. He says, and because you have stood with me, I confer on you a kingdom. You will receive a reward because you are standing with Jesus through this trial. This trial is going to end, but God's reward, God's kingdom is never going to end. And remember, when we're going through this trial, this temptation, it is only for a small time period. It's not going to be an eternal trial. Paul said this to the Corinthian church. When we look at the book of Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, here's what we read. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Now that word there, temptation, it's the same word. Priazo, it's the same word for trial and test. And the apostles telling the church, just like I'm encouraging our church right now, listen, this trial and this temptation might seem hard to us, but God is going to open the doors. There's going to be a way out. But don't give in to temptation during this seclusion. Sometimes it is easier to fall into sin when you are in seclusion, when you are bored, when you are tempted, when you have nothing to do, when your faith is feeling low. You're tempted to commit sins you wouldn't normally enter into in everyday life. Don't give in to the temptation. You remember when Jesus was tempted by the devil? The same word, put through a trial, put through a test by Satan. Eventually Satan had to go because Jesus would not give in to him. And then Jesus was freed to be launched into his ministry. So let's make sure we're doing the same things. Peter also tells us that God knows how to rescue people. He tells us this in his second epistle, chapter 2, from trials. And he uses the same word, and he's talking about Lot being shut in the house and worrying about all the sin and problems that are outside in Sodom and Gomorrah. But Peter says God knows how to rescue us from those trials. God is going to deliver us from all these problems that are happening if we hold fast to him. And we must not become unsettled. Paul said to the Thessalonian church in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, he said, do not become unsettled by all these trials that have come upon you. And he says to the church, I warned you, I told you these things were going to happen. Now, as Christians, we know the terrible things that are going to come on this sinful world. Jesus has told us very clearly all about them. We mustn't become unsettled when we start to see them. All we are seeing is the things that we knew were going to happen anyway. We were foretold of them. Jesus has warned us and prepared us and got us ready for the trials that are going to come on this world. And we know that there are worse things going to come. In Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10, Jesus warned the church there is a severe trial that's going to come upon the whole world to test the whole world. He uses twice the same word there, periazo, test and trial. But he says to the church, I am going to keep you from that hour. I am going to keep you out of the ultimate trial, the period we call the Great Tribulation. Jesus is going to rescue the church from that period. So we mustn't become unsettled with these trials that are happening, because this is not the ultimate test and tribulation that's going to come on this earth. And we know Jesus is going to rescue us from these things. So our faith is strong and our focus is clear in standing with Jesus through these trials. So let's go back to what James says then in conclusion. Let's go back to what James said at the beginning of our reading in chapter 1. The Apostle James says in chapter 1, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And he uses that word several times once again, trials and testings. But he says, consider it pure joy, because as Christians, we know this trial is leading us into greater intimacy with Jesus. It's proving our faith. So we consider it joy, not because it's a joyful experience, but because we know it's going to bring us strength and maturity and perseverance. And James tells us all these wonderful things it's going to bring to us because our faith is being strengthened in the Lord. So consider it joy even as we suffer grief and trials and testings at this time. The Lord is with us. Let's stand with him. Let's resist this temptation, this test, and persevere through this trial because Jesus is with us. So God be with you. Let his blessing be upon you today as we would have normally met to pray, but let his blessing be upon you and stand firm in your faith. God's answer and salvation is sure. Praise his name. Amen.